Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. When a healthy woman collapses without warning, and the only witness is her husband, you don't expect the killer to be so quiet or so patient. Waltham, Massachusetts, September 2004. It was just past 10 o'clock a.m. when the emergency call was placed. The voice on the line was steady, unusually controlled. The man identified himself as James Keown. He reported that his wife, Julie, had lost consciousness. She wasn't breathing right. He didn't sound panicked, didn't fumble his words. And that, according to one of the responding medics, was the first red flag. Julie Irene Keown was 31 years old, employed as a communications assistant. She had no serious medical history, no known allergies, and no history of seizures, fainting, or cardiovascular issues. She wasn't pregnant. She didn't use recreational drugs. There were no prescription medications noted in the home other than over-the-counter acetaminophen. When EMTs arrived, Julie was slumped on the living room floor. Her breathing was shallow, her skin was pale and cold, pupils slow to respond. There was no evidence of trauma, no bruising, lacerations, or indication of a fall. They found an empty bottle of sports drink beside her, which James said she had been drinking that morning. He told paramedics she had been feeling a little off the past few days. Stomach pain, maybe the flu. She was transported to Newton Wellesley Hospital within 15 minutes. But once doctors saw her labs, the situation changed. Her blood panel came back showing severe metabolic acidosis, pH levels off the chart. Her kidney and liver enzymes were spiking rapidly. Toxicology was flagged. Notably, calcium oxalate crystals were observed during urinalysis. It was a detail only one attending doctor picked up on right away, quietly scribbling in the margin of his report. Ethylene glycol. That doctor had seen it before, once in a deliberate poisoning case out of Vermont. Ethylene glycol is the main ingredient in antifreeze. It's odorless, colorless, slightly sweet-tasting. In small doses, it mimics the flu. In moderate doses, it destroys organs. In high doses, it's fatal. Julie had no car maintenance tools at home, no access to that kind of chemical, but she was deteriorating by the hour. James Keown remained in the waiting room, cooperative but oddly composed. He made no requests to speak with doctors, no visible signs of distress. According to ICU nurses, he left twice that afternoon to answer calls from what he claimed were work contacts. Later, investigators would confirm he had no job. In fact, he hadn't had one in months. At 3:30 p.m., hospital staff moved Julie to intensive care. She had slipped into a coma. Her heart rate was irregular, her kidneys had failed, her liver was showing signs of necrosis. A dialysis unit was prepared, but doctors were doubtful she would regain consciousness. As the attending physician reviewed Julie's medical chart and blood work, he paused over one point: the speed of decline. He circled the estimated onset. Then he underlined a note. No vomiting, no diarrhea, just shut down. It didn't line up with accidental exposure, and it didn't match a viral cause either. Back at the couple's apartment, a detective from Waltham PD conducted a welfare check and preservation sweep. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. The place was clean, too clean. The fridge was stocked with typical groceries. One bottle of blue Gatorade was missing. The trash can was empty, completely. The apartment manager would later say James had asked to use the complex dumpster the morning Julie was taken to the hospital. Within 24 hours, medical staff submitted a formal toxicology request to the state lab. A nurse practitioner, who had overheard James speaking to a visitor, quietly informed police that he'd made a comment about Julie not drinking enough fluids, and that maybe her organs just couldn't handle the stress. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Julie was pronounced dead 8 days after her admission. The official cause of death was listed as multiple organ failure due to acute toxic ingestion, pending final tox report. Hospital protocol demanded an autopsy due to unexplained rapid decline. Samples were sent to a private forensic lab in Boston. As that process unfolded, James Keown left Massachusetts. He returned to Missouri. In small towns and suburban cities like Waltham, sudden deaths aren't just anomalies. They're fractures in the familiar. When someone like Julie, young, healthy, well-liked, dies under unexplained circumstances, the ripples hit hard. But they also raise questions. And in this case, those questions weren't just about what killed her, but who stood to gain the most. and why no one saw it coming. Waltham PD's initial report listed the spouse as cooperative. That's standard language in unexplained death cases. Cooperative means the person answers questions, doesn't raise their voice, and doesn't walk out. But cooperation doesn't mean innocence. It just buys time. James Keown was 31 years old. His driver's license listed a Missouri address, but he had lived in Massachusetts for roughly 2 years with his wife, Julie. On paper, he presented as educated, charismatic, and stable. In conversation, he was articulate, composed, and self-assured. He introduced himself as a former radio broadcaster and current MBA candidate at Babson College. No flags, no priors, no reason, on first glance, to dig deeper. But once a body is on the table and a tox screen shows signs of poison, first glances stop mattering. 2 detectives from the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office began a background check. They called Babson. No student named James Keown had been enrolled in any program full-time or part-time since 2002. That detail hadn't been mentioned in the emergency report. The school's registrar confirmed he never even applied. They looked into employment. James had claimed to work remotely in marketing for a pharmaceutical company based in Chicago. A quick records check revealed no such company existed. The address he gave matched a UPS mailbox rental store. No employment records, no tax returns filed under that name, no W-2s in the state for the past 2 years. In Missouri, James had worked briefly as a radio personality. He had been laid off 6 months before relocating to Massachusetts. His departure was described by a former colleague as sudden and personal. He didn't return for his last paycheck. The next question was money. Julie's bank accounts showed a pattern of withdrawals over the past year, small, frequent, rarely explained. She'd written checks labeled tuition and course fees, but the institutions were never verified. One $5,000 check had been cashed at a convenience store ATM just weeks before her hospitalization. Credit cards opened under Julie's name had rapidly ballooned. Her credit score had dropped nearly 120 points in 9 months. She had no history of financial mismanagement prior to marriage. Investigators requested her life insurance policy. It had been updated in June 2004. Julie's signature was present. The beneficiary was James. Policy value, $250,000. Insurance agents confirmed the policy had been processed through an independent broker. Unusual detail. The original policy was filed under Julie's maiden name, Oldag, but was rewritten under Julie Keown just 3 months before her death. James had initiated the paperwork. Forensic accountants flagged one final detail. The monthly auto pay on the premium was drawn from Julie's personal checking, not a joint account. Julie had never mentioned the policy to her family or coworkers. She may not have known it existed at all. The local postal carrier for their apartment complex was interviewed. She stated that Julie regularly picked up the mail and seemed organized. However, in August, the carrier recalled James intercepting several envelopes addressed to Julie marked Policy Renewal Notice. He had said she was too busy that week. It wasn't until the case analyst mapped the couple's financial trajectory, income versus expenditure, that the pattern took shape. Julie was supporting 2 people, but the expenses weren't adding up to shared living. They were adding up to someone preparing for separation, just not the legal kind. One investigator noted in his report, he wasn't building a future, he was burning through one. Neighbors were canvassed again. One reported hearing arguments in the apartment around Labor Day, nothing violent but loud and one-sided. The voice was male. Another recalled seeing James carrying multiple trash bags to the complex dumpster early one morning, days before Julie collapsed. This wasn't reported at the time. No surveillance footage existed. The building's camera system was inactive due to maintenance, verified by management. That left the timeline between September 2nd and September 8th as critical. Julie had begun experiencing symptoms as early as September 3rd, nausea, confusion, lightheadedness. She told a coworker she felt like she was walking through mud. Her primary care physician had not been contacted. Toxicologists later noted that ethylene glycol poisoning, when administered in slow, repeated doses, presents precisely that way. No immediate collapse. Just a gradual systems failure. By the end of the second week of inquiry, James Keown had returned to Missouri, without a job, without a degree, and, so far, without being charged. But something didn't sit right. Julie's death had too many loose ends, and her husband's answers were too neatly folded. Sometimes in homicide work, it's not what you can prove that drives you. It's what you can't let go of. By the time Julie Keown's body arrived at the State Forensic Lab in Boston, nearly 2 weeks had passed since her hospitalization. The cause of death listed on the initial report, multiple organ failure, was accurate but incomplete. What needed confirmation was whether that failure had a cause beyond natural pathology, and whether it was delivered intentionally. Dr. Patricia Raymond was the assigned medical examiner. She'd been in the field for nearly 2 decades. Her process was methodical, detached, but exact. She didn't speculate. She documented. During the external examination, no trauma was evident, no contusions, needle marks, petechiae, or abrasions. That supported what the hospital records had already indicated. There was no physical struggle. The internal exam, however, raised flags within the first hour. The kidneys showed signs of acute tubular necrosis. The liver, while intact structurally, had visible fatty changes and swelling. The brain was mildly edematous. Yeah, but what concerned Dr. Raymond most was the degree of crystal formation in the renal tissue. Under microscope, calcium oxalate crystals, sharp, irregular birefringent, were visible. Their presence was consistent with ethylene glycol toxicity. A full toxicology panel was requested, including gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GCMS. It would take another 7 days for the final results to return. While the body lay cold in evidence storage, the toxic data began telling its own story. The results confirmed high levels of ethylene glycol. Metabolites, including glycolic acid and oxalic acid, were elevated beyond normal accidental exposure thresholds. It wasn't a small sip, it wasn't environmental. The pattern suggested progressive, repeated dosing over multiple days. There was no alcohol detected, which ruled out masking agents sometimes used in co-ingestion. No sedatives, no prescription medication overdose, no confounding agents. The key forensic breakthrough came from the tissue concentration curve. Based on known ethylene glycol metabolism rates, forensic pharmacologists estimated at least 3 distinct ingestion events over a span of 72 to 96 hours. In other words, Julie had been poisoned in stages. The delivery method wasn't chemically traceable, but the viscosity of the compound and the lack of damage to the esophagus indicated dilution in a liquid, possibly juice, possibly a sports drink. The presence of citrus pulp fragments in her stomach content suggested Gatorade or similar. The timeline matched the account her husband gave EMTs. She'd been drinking it that morning. Forensic toxicology reports were filed with the DA's office under a non-accidental exposure header. That alone didn't prove murder, but it ruled out natural death. The fatal agent had been ingested in amounts that no adult would consume unintentionally, unless misled. When the case file was reopened for secondary review, investigators returned to the original hospital documentation. One of Julie's nurses had taken a note during an overnight shift. Patient intermittently conscious, mumbles tastes wrong. Husband insists juice is her favorite. A hospital technician remembered James Keown bringing drinks in a clear cup. No one asked what was in it. No one tested it. That mistake couldn't be undone, but the pattern was now consistent. A woman gets sick. Her condition worsens over several days. Her husband brings her fluids. No witnesses see the preparation. She slips into a coma, then dies. Her organs show signs of chemical attack. The compound is specific. The timeline is specific. And someone stayed close, but silent. In towns like Waltham, where medical mistakes are rare and murder even rarer, the presence of a forensic footprint changes everything. This wasn't a vague suspicion anymore. It was now a matter of proof. One analyst from the DA's office included a single line in their interdepartmental memo. The data aligns too cleanly. That's what concerns me. They were beginning to suspect the poisoner had counted on the medical team, not recognizing the signs fast enough. And they were right. Julie's body was returned to her family for burial. The final cause of death was officially updated. Acute ethylene glycol poisoning administered orally, consistent with homicide. The report didn't say who. It didn't have to. It just eliminated how. The next step was turning lab results into a prosecutable narrative. But before charges could be filed, one last piece was still missing: access. How did the poison get into her body without her knowing? That answer would emerge not from a body but from a computer, If you want to know someone's intention, you don't ask their friends. You check their search history. 2 weeks after Julie Keown's death was officially ruled a homicide by toxic ingestion, the Middlesex County DA's office secured a search warrant for the couple's home computer. The device, a modest Dell desktop, had been seized by responding officers during the initial welfare check, but remained untouched, pending toxicology confirmation. Now, investigators had a green light to dig. The hard drive was cloned and sent to the Massachusetts State Police Computer Crimes Unit. Analysts were instructed to prioritize any queries related to toxic substances, life insurance, or online purchases in the weeks leading up to Julie's symptoms. Their findings didn't just corroborate suspicions, they escalated them. Within minutes of scanning the browser cache, analysts found a sequence of searches dating back to mid-August 2004. These weren't idle curiosities, they were calculated. Terms included ethylene glycol taste, how to poison someone and not get caught, antifreeze human ingestion symptoms, organ failure timeline after antifreeze, can you trace glycol in autopsy, how to administer ethylene glycol without detection. These weren't bookmarked, they were cleared. Deleted using the browser's private mode but still recoverable in temp files. The pattern showed multiple visits to chemistry forums, crime scene analysis articles, and archived news reports from the early 1990s involving similar substances. It wasn't just what he searched, it was how often. More than 30 sessions were logged across 3 weeks, some as long as an hour, all between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., mostly while Julie was reportedly asleep. One particularly damning visit was to a page on the lethal dosage of ethylene glycol for a 130-pound adult. The timing, August 27th. Julie first mentioned not feeling right to a coworker on September 2nd. Analysts cross-checked the browsing history with browser autofill entries. James Keown had used Julie's email address to set up online orders on a major auto parts site. Order history showed a purchase of 2 one-quart bottles of Prestone antifreeze on August 25th, billed to their home address. Payment was made using a debit card tied to a joint account, one that Julie's family later confirmed she never used for purchases. A delivery confirmation email was sent to James's alternate Gmail account on August 27th at 2:04 p.m. Package delivered same day. No signature required. That's not all. Investigators pulled cached records of a second order placed September 1st, this time for plastic transfer syringes, listed as for automotive fluids. James used the same alias email, but delivery was routed to a nearby P.O. box under his name. Surveillance footage of the post office was unavailable, but the delivery record matched James's signature on file from a Missouri DMV application. Digital forensic teams documented every keystroke. The data timeline was airtight. Between August 25th and September 6th, James Keown had researched the compound, purchased the tools, ordered the substance, learned how to avoid detection, erased what he thought were the digital tracks. But nothing disappears permanently, not when someone knows what to look for. What stood out to one investigator wasn't just the sequence. It was the silence in between. The gaps between research and action were wide enough to suggest premeditation, but narrow enough to confirm intent. He didn't act impulsively. He waited, planned, and executed. He learned what dosage wouldn't show symptoms immediately. He used that information to stretch Julie's suffering across days, long enough to delay suspicion, short enough to avoid full metabolic elimination of the toxin. The data wasn't emotional, it didn't accuse, but it was irrefutable. Every action left a fingerprint, every keystroke, a timestamp. And at the end of that digital trail stood a woman whose body had already told the truth. Now her browser history was backing her up. There was no question anymore whether Julie had been murdered. The only question left, one the prosecution was preparing for, was whether a jury could see what the hard drive had made painfully obvious. Sometimes it isn't the crime scene that convicts. Sometimes it's a late-night search bar. In public, James Keown's voice was his asset. He knew how to control tone, pause at the right moments, and redirect when needed. He had worked in radio. He understood performance. But what investigators would eventually realize was that James didn't just use his voice professionally, he weaponized it personally. After Julie was admitted to the hospital in early September 2004, James stayed by her side almost constantly. To hospital staff, he appeared attentive. He spoke softly. He made light jokes. He assured nurses that Julie was tough, that she'd bounce back. But behind the small talk, his behavior followed a pattern that didn't go unnoticed. A nurse assigned to Julie's care during the night shift documented in her log that James never asked about test results. He never pushed for updates. When doctors came with explanations, some of them grim, he listened but didn't engage. Not once did he ask, "What's causing this?" or "Could it be poisoning?" That silence mattered. What also mattered was how little he shared with Julie's family. They lived out of state. Her parents hadn't even been told she was in the hospital until she had already slipped into a coma. When they finally arrived, James greeted them with rehearsed calm. According to Julie's sister, he minimized the urgency. He told them things were under control, but nothing was under control. After Julie passed away, James remained in Massachusetts for less than 2 weeks. Then he quietly left. He returned to Missouri, where he contacted a former radio station colleague. He was looking for work. He pitched himself as a free agent with time to return to the air. At this point, Julie had been dead for less than a month. In Missouri, James re-entered the broadcast world. He took a short-term hosting role at a local AM station. He told producers he had taken a break from school to refocus on career goals. He never mentioned a wife, never mentioned a death, and definitely never mentioned a toxicology report showing ethylene glycol in her blood. One colleague would later tell detectives that James seemed unbothered, even cheerful. He joked on air. He kept a clean script. But off-air, he often used the station's computer late at night. He brought in his own laptop, too, always password-locked. No one pressed him. In small-market radio, eccentricity wasn't suspicious. It was expected. But something else stood out. James ran a blog, a personal one. It didn't have many readers, but cached versions revealed a strange pattern. In one post dated mid-October 2004, James wrote vaguely about grief, referring to letting go of someone you love when it's not your choice. He followed the paragraph with an unrelated story about radio industry trends. The tone was mismatched, detached. Prosecutors later described it as emotional laundering. Enough sentiment to imply loss, no detail that admitted accountability. Meanwhile, financial records showed that James began requesting information from Julie's life insurance provider just 6 weeks after her death. He inquired about the claim timeline and asked whether additional documentation was required. He didn't mention the cause of death or that the claim might be contested due to pending investigation. The insurer flagged the request. Quietly, they contacted the Middlesex County DA. Back in Massachusetts, investigators had begun compiling witness statements from hospital staff. Their goal was to build a profile, not just of opportunity, but of mindset. Why would a husband act with such precision? And why would someone capable of this crime behave with such surface normalcy? The lead investigator on the case noted in his report, his public behavior didn't just lack remorse, it lacked curiosity. He never once asked who was looking into Julie's death. That absence of inquiry was telling. Julie's friends described her as attentive, methodical, and generous. She was the one who paid bills on time, remembered birthdays, and scheduled appointments. James had relied on her stability, but resented her control. Their relationship, while outwardly functional, was quietly imbalanced. Julie held the structure, James held the resentment. And when that resentment turned to action, he calculated the consequences down to the dosage. What he didn't calculate was the forensic trail he left behind, or how his own lack of emotion would become evidence. This chapter of the investigation wasn't about what was found in a lab. It was about the people who observed James when he thought no one was paying attention. It was about tone, timing, and detachment. Murder isn't always a loud act. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it talks through smiles. And sometimes it leaves the room before anyone knows what's missing. When a case builds over months, there's rarely a single moment where everything clicks. But there are thresholds. Points where the data stops being interesting and becomes conclusive. By February 2007, prosecutors in Middlesex County agreed. This case had crossed that threshold. The timeline was stable. The motive had been established through financial records and life insurance documents. The opportunity was confined to one person. And now, between browser history, toxicology, and behavioral anomalies, they had convergence. Still, charging someone with murder, especially a clean-cut, seemingly respectable man like James Keown, required more than theory. It demanded prosecutorial clarity. Every gap had to close. To do that, investigators needed to reconstruct James's physical movements in the final days before Julie's collapse. There was no surveillance footage from inside the couple's home, but there were transaction records, postal logs, and cell tower data. It began with two key pieces. First, purchase history. James's online order of Prestone antifreeze had been processed through AutoZone's e-commerce platform. The billing was under Julie's card. The shipping confirmation timestamped the delivery to their Waltham apartment on August 27, 2004. Second, a secondary purchase was made September 1st, a set of industrial-grade plastic syringes marketed for fluid extraction and automotive maintenance. This order, linked to a P.O. box registered in James's name, was traced back to a location 3 miles from their home. He signed for the package. The timestamp was 9:43 a.m. During a weekday, Julie was known to be at work. Cell phone metadata placed James near that post office location on 2 other occasions during the same week. He told investigators he'd been handling errands. No specific details. Forensic analysts also identified printer ink residue on a discarded label found in a shared trash bin outside the apartment complex. The partial adhesive matched the shipping format of the syringe order. It had been torn, balled up, and coated in coffee grounds, but lab technicians reconstructed enough of the barcode to link it to James's P.O. box. This was no longer circumstantial. It was methodical. Meanwhile, the toxicology report had already confirmed progressive ingestion of ethylene glycol across a 72-96-hour window, matching exactly the time frame in which these materials were acquired, delivered, and disposed of. One detail that turned internal discussion into legal action came from a witness statement, a retired neighbor who lived across the hall from James and Julie. She recalled hearing a blender running for a long time, several evenings in a row before Julie was hospitalized. At the time, she assumed James was making smoothies. He wasn't. Lab reports showed that antifreeze, when mixed with flavored beverages, masks its taste best when blended and chilled. The compound remains lethal even after dilution. After months of silent preparation, the DA's office convened a closed-door meeting with state police, forensic analysts, and a senior homicide prosecutor. The objective: confirm if the chain of evidence met the standard for a first-degree murder indictment. The conclusion was unanimous. Julie had been deliberately poisoned. The substance was purchased in advance, it was administered repeatedly, and the person who had motive, access, and knowledge was the only person who remained by her side until her death. There was no third party, no random contamination, no possible accident. In early March 2007, an arrest warrant was issued for James Keown. At that time, he was living in Jefferson City, Missouri, working at a local radio station and maintaining a small public blog. Authorities coordinated with Missouri State Police to approach him outside his workplace. He was detained without incident and held pending extradition. His first statement to police was short. He claimed to be shocked and confused. He requested legal counsel. He did not ask about Julie, no resistance, no questions, just the same silence he'd maintained since her collapse. In murder cases built on forensic sequencing, the trial isn't about proving what happened. It's about proving who did it and why. By the summer of 2008, nearly 4 years after Julie Keown died in a hospital bed outside Boston, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was ready to put her husband on the stand, not for testimony, but for judgment. The state's case began with structure. Assistant District Attorney Stephen Arisian opened with the basics: a healthy woman, a sudden collapse, and a toxicological profile that couldn't have been accidental. From there, he mapped the chain: search history, purchases, behavior, and motive. The jury didn't need to interpret intention. They just needed to follow the pattern. The trial took place in Middlesex Superior Court. It lasted 2 weeks. The evidence, however, had been building for years. The first key witness was the forensic pathologist. She presented autopsy slides, walking the jury through images of Julie's kidney tissue showing calcium oxalate crystal formations, visible proof of ethylene glycol poisoning. She confirmed it had been administered in repeated doses, not a one-time event. Her voice was steady, clinical. She wasn't there to speculate. She was there to confirm this was a homicide. Next came the digital forensic team. They displayed screenshots recovered from James's hard drive, Google searches, deleted email confirmations, timestamps from late-night activity. Their focus was narrow: what was typed, when, and how often. Nothing speculative, just facts that couldn't be explained away. Julie's sister testified about phone calls left unanswered during the final days of Julie's life. She recalled how James minimized the situation and delayed their visit. She stated under oath that Julie never mentioned owning life insurance. That alone didn't prove guilt, but it raised the question, who was managing Julie's affairs? Then came the insurance representative. Calm, procedural, she confirmed the timeline. James had initiated the policy under Julie's name, listed himself as sole beneficiary, and began inquiry into the payout less than 6 weeks after her death. He hadn't waited for the cause of death to be finalized. He hadn't disclosed that she died under suspicious circumstances. One of the most subtle yet impactful testimonies came from a nurse at Newton Wellesley Hospital. She testified that James never asked questions, that he accepted each update from doctors without resistance or confusion, that he offered juice to Julie at specific hours and removed the containers himself. She couldn't testify about poison, but she could testify about pattern. The defense offered an alternative theory that Julie may have ingested the substance accidentally, possibly through contamination from a cleaning product or garage item, but they failed to present a single item recovered from the apartment or garage containing ethylene glycol. The empty bottles found in the trash matched James's online purchases, not household items, and the defense never explained the browser history. James Keown declined to testify. His attorneys focused instead on raising doubt, but without an alternative theory grounded in evidence, their arguments fell flat. One juror later said in a post-trial interview, there wasn't a single piece that stood on its own, but once you lined them all up, you couldn't ignore it. In his closing remarks, Erisian kept it simple. You don't have to imagine a killer. You just have to look at the facts. He searched, he bought, he fed, and now he waits. He's waited long enough. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On July 21, 2008, James Keown was found guilty of first-degree murder. Under Massachusetts law, the mandatory sentence was life in prison without parole. The courtroom remained silent. James showed no visible emotion. Julie's family declined to make a public statement, but privately, they told investigators that justice hadn't brought closure, just accountability. Julie was gone. Her life wasn't a case. It had been a career, a marriage, a future, but at least now someone answered for it. In true crime, trials often feel like endings, but legally they're the beginning of consequence. In this case, it was also the final opportunity for the facts to be heard in full, without manipulation, without charm, and without the quiet that had masked everything. The court had listened. The evidence had spoken. Julie Keown died in 2004. Her cause of death, acute ethylene glycol poisoning, was confirmed within weeks. Her husband was convicted in 2008. The trial was brief. The sentence was permanent. But the reverberations of a crime like this don't stop at the courthouse steps. They linger in records, in interviews, in silence. After the conviction, James Keown was remanded to the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. He was assigned to a maximum security facility. No appeals were filed that changed the outcome. No statements of remorse were submitted. He has maintained innocence since the day of his arrest. There was no media frenzy, no book deals, no Dateline special. The case never reached national headlines in the way more sensational crimes have. But to those who lived it, it didn't need to. For Julie's family, the trial's conclusion wasn't relief. It was the close of a door that should never have been opened in the first place. Her parents returned to Missouri with a copy of the autopsy, a box of her belongings, and a death certificate they never imagined would bear the words, homicide. Julie had no children, no personal journal. Her voice exists now only through medical records, work emails, and secondhand memories. That's part of what makes this kind of murder so insidious. There's no scene, no scream, no weapon, just a slow erasure of a person's health followed by a void where questions should have been asked. The lead investigator on the case, now retired, once gave a closed lecture to new homicide detectives. He referenced the Keown case not because of its complexity, but because of its subtlety. He didn't need to fight her. He just needed her to trust him, he said. And she did. That's what stays with people. Not just the act itself, but the breach of something fundamental. The crime wasn't just against a person, it was against a relationship, against assumption. Julie had no reason to question the person sleeping beside her. That lack of suspicion cost her everything. In the years since the conviction, the Keown case has been cited in training modules for digital forensics and toxicology. It's a case study in how behavioral cues, internet history, and chemical evidence can align across disciplines to reveal intent. It has also become a quiet warning in domestic violence advocacy circles, proof that not all abuse leaves bruises. There is no monument to Julie Keown, no foundation, but that doesn't mean her life or her death didn't matter. Sometimes the most important names aren't the ones we remember because they were famous, but because they were failed. It's worth asking why no one outside the medical staff questioned James's behavior in those final days. Why no alarm was raised when he removed cups himself. Why Julie never told anyone about the supposed life insurance policy. But asking doesn't change the past. It only sharpens our responsibility going forward. Julie's former coworkers held a small memorial service at the office where she worked. It wasn't formal. No speeches. Just a photo on a desk and a moment of silence. That's what grief looks like when there's no space for rage. Just quiet acknowledgement that someone should still be here, but isn't. If there's one lesson that rises out of the documents and evidence, it's this. Manipulation doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like reassurance. And when control comes dressed as care, it's harder to resist and harder to spot. Julie trusted the wrong person. That trust was used against her. And while justice was served in a courtroom, prevention would have been better served by earlier questions, by attention to patterns, by listening to the discomfort beneath the routine. This story doesn't end with James Keown behind bars. It ends in the homes where people still assume that love and safety always walk hand in hand, where silence is mistaken for peace, where explanations are taken at face value because asking more would seem impolite. Julie wasn't weak, she wasn't naive, she was trusting, and she was targeted. Some murders shatter. This one dissolved. And in that dissolution, it taught us that not all violence is loud. Some of it is patient, private, and almost invisible, until it's not. Julie's death reminds us that protecting someone doesn't mean controlling them, that attention isn't the same as care, that just because someone seems calm doesn't mean they're incapable of calculated harm. What remains of Julie Keown is more than a case file or conviction record. It's a warning, quietly delivered to anyone willing to pay attention. And sometimes that's the difference between missing the signs and saving a life. In the end, stories like Julie's aren't just about crime. They're about the blind spots we all carry. If you take one thing from this case, let it be this. Never confuse control with care. Ask questions, even when the answers might be uncomfortable. I've seen how quiet manipulation can steal a life long before the final breath. If this story reached you, I hope it also reminds you to protect your peace, trust your instincts, and pay attention to the silences. If this video moved you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from or what this case made you reflect on. And if it didn't resonate, I'd still love to hear your thoughts. Your feedback matters. If you found value in this story, subscribe to the channel. More cases, more truths are on the way.